It may not be fair, but as a leader, we're always expected to be the bigger person in any sort of interaction. It's not easy, and it can take a toll. Welcome back to Neuroconversion Leadership, where we talk about effective leadership and communication in the STEM workplace. I'm Jeremy Doran, and I love to help great engineers become great leaders. And today, we have someone who's very successfully made that transition, Andrew Kamholz. Andrew has a PhD in bioengineering. He holds 14 patents, and he's written in over a dozen publications. Andrew, welcome.
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
And another thing that I read about you is that you love baseball statistics. Hopefully you're going to tell me that you root for the correct team.
So it's funny because I grew up in New Jersey, and I grew up being interested in both the Yankees and the Phillies because they were on my local TV broadcasts. And any baseball fans of a certain age will know the Braves were also accessible and a couple other teams. But those are the teams I grew up really liking. But the older I got, the more I became sort of a fan of the game. And I'd say I'm kind of a fan of baseball and not of any specific team. I like watching any team do well and players do well and all that. So I don't root for or against any team these days.
That is a great non-offensive answer, so thank you. So what is it about the baseball statistics that has always interested you?
You know, I think like a lot of kids, I started with baseball cards as a teenager and got really interested in the numbers on the back, and then got access to the baseball encyclopedia, which before the internet was the only place you could get a collection of all baseball statistics. Spent hours or days, I don't know, poring over that. And then, you know, I just started writing a little bit and then got connected with various websites and various print publications that were interested in having me write stuff. So I've written for USA Today and New York Times and other places like that. And it's just sort of always held my interest.
And do you think that's related in any way to your interest in engineering? And is it common amongst other engineers, do you think?
I mean, definitely baseball fans who have a leaning towards the statistical side, I would say tend, on average, more often to be engineering types. Certainly not exclusively by any means, but it's definitely not an unusual thing. I mean, listen, you gotta like math and you gotta like equations for both to a certain degree. So it makes sense that there's overlap.
Can you tell us a little bit about your journey? So you started out in engineering and now you're the CEO of a company. Can you tell us how it came from one to the other?
Yeah, it quite naturally, I guess. So I did my studies at my undergrad in biomedical engineering and a PhD in bioengineering, specialized in microfluidics, which is this field around small-scale experiments to do diagnostics, typically for blood, that sort of thing. And it was an emerging field in the 90s and has sort of emerged but not necessarily blossomed in the way a lot of people expected. It's around and it's a powerful part of a number of products that are out there, but it's maybe not the central technology that many of us thought it would be by this time. But it is an essential use in a number of really important technology and healthcare related products. And I went and took a job working sort of in research in microfluidics, doing engineering research, and eventually kind of moved into management and took another job. That company that I was working for, which was a division of TCAN, which is a fine Austrian company that still operates and is a wonderful company today. I worked for them. They closed the division that I worked for, which was this side offshoot. And I looked and I said, gosh, they have some interesting hardware here. They've developed some special methods for thermoforming plastics, which are not really patentable, but are really interesting. What if I started my own company and tried to use this for something a little bit different from what they were using it for? And my wife and I were relatively newly married at that time. In fact, we got married that same year, 2005, and didn't have any kids and both had jobs and all the rest of that. My wife said, yeah, it seems like as good a time as any to do it. So we put in a little seed capital, bought that equipment. I started what was then called Edge Embossing Incorporated. And so I was CEO by default because I was also the janitor and the engineer and the research scientist and the patent attorney and everything else. So, then we had, I had this basically one person company. And from there it grew in fits and starts where we added some key customers, and I was able to actually add a couple people to the staff, mostly people who were very early in their careers and were not high paid people, but were people who were really able to add value. Slowly built that up. And I said to a friend of mine, like, this is killing me in terms of like cash flow and like having to pay people every month, and I'm waiting to get checks from customers, and I better get this thing out in the mail so they get it so I can invoice, so in 30 days I have the money and all that. And I said, it's driving me crazy. I just want to do the work and do good work and get paid for it, And what happened was his company actually bought my company. And we just basically became a wholly contained unit of that company. And then we're bought out wholly by Kamholz, who's now our current owner. So although I'm CEO of a wholly owned entity, right? On paper, I'm CEO. I have the authority and responsibility at that level within the organization. But just like anybody, I have bosses. I have a board I report to. I have people I have to answer to. And I'm part of a larger organization.
So that has been a lot of moving parts.
It has been, yeah.
When you were working before starting that company, you said that you became a manager. How long were you a manager, and what lessons did you learn there that you took to when you started your own business?
What a great question. So I started actually my first job in a somewhat managerial role. I went to a company that had about 20 to 25 employees. And a lot of them were recent college grads or people who didn't work in the engineering department, but worked, let's say in HR or legal or other places. And so there weren't that many high-level engineering people. So I kind of came in with a PhD as already one of the more knowledgeable people. So I kind of got put into a managerial position from the beginning. And I learned pretty quickly right away that I was way better at sort of helping other people design their experiments, interpret their results, plan their work, execute their work well, learn how to do it better. I was better at all that than I was at my own hands-on research.
Interesting.
And what's interesting is, just to go back to baseball for a minute, I found that the same was true with baseball writing. So there was a period of time when I had a weekly column it was actually in USA Today Weekly, not the daily paper, but the weekly paper that they put out, which is a sports paper. And after the first year or so, I started pulling in other writers. And I said to the editor, can I have other people write, and I'll edit their stuff and you can just publish it under their byline? He said, sure, I don't care, Great. And I found right away that I was way better at helping other people analyze their ideas and fully flesh them out and helping sort of edit their writing than I was at my own writing or coming up with my own ideas. And so there was a consistency there. My next job, the one at TCAN, I actually had to do quite a bit more hands-on work. And it was actually a smaller company at that time. And that's when I started having my first big challenges with managing, because there were a couple people there where I just managed them very poorly and had very poor skills in terms of what did that person need, what was I doing as a manager, and had my first real experience of, just not getting along at all. And that was a hard period where I really had to look and say, like, as a manager, what am I doing wrong? Like, what am I not doing right? Like, what am I missing about this situation and these people that is causing me to have friction with them instead of a productive relationship? And I'm not sure I ever got answers, because the plug was pulled on that company before it was ever resolved. But at least the questions formed in my mind of, like, you got to be thinking about these things when you're managing people. So I think that was an important failure for me.
What kind of resources were available, or did you seek out when you were having that struggle?
Another great question. And so my first thought is I probably failed to really even think a lot about what resources were available to me and to reach out, which I think has been another sort of soft point in my productivity as a person over my career. It took me a long time to realize, like, hey, there's lots of people who can help with lots of things. You just got to get out there and ask for it and find the right people. So I definitely, when I talked to my boss in that situation, I said, hey, I'm really having problems with so-and-so. What do you recommend? And what I remember hearing was something like, yeah, so-and-so is a real pain and it's real hard to get along with. And that's why I gave them to you, because I didn't want to have to manage them anymore.
Thank you.
And yeah, and what's interesting is obviously that person could have chosen to tell me that at the beginning instead of once things were already in a bad spot. But, what I know now that I didn't know then was I definitely should have intervened in my own situation much sooner. I should have asked for help sooner. I should have worked with the employee who I had, where the biggest issues existed much sooner. I should have sat down with that person, communicated better, much sooner.
It's pretty interesting. The skills that make people good at engineering are not necessarily what makes them good at being managers or leaders. They're so used to solving their own problems that everything looks like a problem that they can figure out and solve on their own. So it's really hard sometimes to realize this is a totally different skill set and there are places I can go to get help with it.
That's an excellent point, and there might be times when it's hubris, but I think you're poking at something deeper, which is like, as an engineer, you're taught in school, like, no, you have to know how to do this. You have to work it out. You have to be able to write the equations and solve the equations. You have to be able to know what equations apply. You have, that's a big part of the whole discipline of being taught engineering. Now, there's a much greater emphasis these days in school for group work and group projects and group solving, but that doesn't change the fact that every student is expected to know the complete solution, right? So I think you're right. It does come very naturally to many engineers to say, I just have to work harder and I'll figure out how to do this.
So it sounds like you were kind of a natural at it. You may have had that struggle, but you said that early on you realized you were better at helping other people be productive than necessarily yourself. So that is an interesting challenge that very many people have when they become a manager. They want to do the thing and kind of take pride in the thing. And what they really should take pride in is their people doing a thing.
Yeah, and that's, when I get asked by people early in their careers about career advice, that's one of the first things that I say to them, is like, hey, do you want to be at the bench doing the work, or do you want to be in the back office talking to the people who are doing the work and helping them design it and understand it? And usually when you frame the question that way, you get a really direct answer. Like people tend to know themselves. Because I hear from people, oh my God, the idea of like not doing the work myself, it's crazy. Like I could never, ever, ever do that. That as a person who's not ready to step away from being the everyday scientist or everyday engineer. But then you get answers from people who are like, oh my God, I would so much rather be helping other people, fix their work and optimize their work and learn more and do better. I feel like I can offer way more if I'm talking to 5 or 10 people doing that instead of just at my own bench doing my own thing. And that's a person who's thinking about being a leader.
Yeah, it would be nice if people were asked that directly more often, because most often they're good at being an engineer or scientist and they get promoted to management and they've never thought about it.
Yeah, and I've been around people who've gotten promoted and were absolutely terrified and horrified. And I've heard people say, I would rather go back to my old salary and my old job. And some of those people, their opinions changed once they sort of dipped their toe in the water and got into it. And some of those people never reverted. They always wanted to go back to their old job.
When you were talking about the journey of your business and how it kind of got bought and merged, so you were not only working as a leader of technical people, you were also on the other end dealing with, investors, and that's a whole different type of conversation. How did you balance having both of those types of conversations, which, to be honest, is not something that normally comes naturally to most engineers?
No, that's true. And how did I do that? I would say with difficulty, because everyone has their own agenda and everyone has their own things that matter to them and everyone has their own style. And for example, Anzu Partners, the firm that invested in Edge and invested in me, they're fantastic. They're relatively new fund. I can't quite remember the timing, but it's still less than 10 years old at this point. But they have some very, very experienced people. But they have people who are used to doing things in their way, and it's different from my way. There was not I would say friction, but there was always me trying to understand what it is that matters to them and how to satisfy them. Then me turning to my employees and what matters to them and figuring out how to satisfy them. right? And I think anybody who's been in a leadership position knows you have to be very you have to really control the flow of information in both directions, right? You have to be sending messages to the investors that are very realistic about your status and your technology and where you're going. You can't run to them every time you have a great experimental result and say, guys, I've cracked the atom. Maybe you did crack the atom, but you're probably a few years away from actually, knowing what to do with it, right? Similarly, if an investor gives you a piece of good news or bad news, you can't run back to your team and share that and have them be on an emotional roller coaster, whether it's good or bad, right? They need to have a much more, much steadier sense of how things are going and feel safe, not feel like they're in for a wild ride. Because that's not what the let's say bench level engineer scientist is signing up for when they join a company because they want to be on a roller coaster. No, they just want to do good work. So it's very hard, very hard. And I would say, by the way, Anzu's easier than most. Like they're very reasonable. Most investors are really focused on how to get some sizzling return in really short order so that they can raise their next fund, that sort of thing. Anzu, during the time when we reported part of their portfolio, pushed hard to not do that. That's not part of their thinking at all, and that's not typical.
And still it wasn't easy.
No, not easy. I mean, I think that the issue is if you care, it's hard. And that's sort of true of all things in life, It's like, security lines at the airport haven't been very bad for a while, but especially those of us who are old enough to remember what it was like when TSA first came on the scene, after 9/11. You get to the airport and all bets were off. There could be a line that was an hour and a half long, right? And so if you were going and you were responsible, you get to the airport absolutely at least 2 hours before your flight, maybe even more than that. I mean, I can certainly remember getting to the airport 3 hours before my flight for just a domestic flight. But if you showed up late, you know what would happen? You'd run to the ticket counter and say, I've only got, my plane's boarding in 25 minutes, and that line looks too long. And they'd say, okay, come with me. And they take you, and they push you up to the front of the line, and they push, they squeeze you through, right? Which I respect that the employees are just trying to get people where they're trying to go and not have to have people have canceled flights and all the rest of that. But who's being punished in that scenario? It's the person who prepared and cared and thought about what was going on. That's the person who took more time out of their day to get there early and now is being further delayed by other people who didn't do that, right? And that's what it is to be somebody who cares, right? To care is to have those intense feelings of trying to satisfy many different people who have many different needs. And it's never going to be easy and it's never going to be perfect, right? It's just not. So it's always hard, I think. I think I now understand where the phrase ignorance is bliss comes from. Because you're not going to be an ignorant leader for very long. Anybody who's in a leadership position is not ignorant and is not experiencing bliss. Because to think and to care is to have difficulty.
I don't know if this applies, but have you ever met leaders who don't necessarily care about their own people, and how much easier would that be, and how much of a challenge is it when you do want the best for your people and there's a difficult conversation you need to have?
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of leaders who don't really care about their people, but again, those situations tend not to last very long. Obviously, particularly, I mean, I'm in the world of small companies, even though Xeon, who we're now part of, is a very large company, in the billions of revenue. Our division is still very small. And if you don't take care of your people, you're going to have problems, right? When there's a bump in the road, when, we still occasionally lose customers. Like that happens to every company that's in a service business. When you lose customers and people have a project that suddenly evaporates, they need to understand what that means and what's going to happen next. And they're not going to be receptive to that if they also think you're a jerk who doesn't care about them. They're not going to want to have the conversation. They're just going to be demotivated, right, to go forward. So I think for me, caring about the people is actually the most important thing. It's more important than the technology. It's more important than who our customers are. It's even more important than how we treat our customers, which of course is itself incredibly important. And, for me, the biggest thing has been to really learn. It's one thing to say you care about your people, and it's another thing to really understand what it is that they need and understand what motivates them. Because initially, I like to think I'm someone who cares about people in general, and most of us are. But initially, when I was leading in my company, I just treated people like the way I wanted to be treated. Mm-hmm. Basic golden rule. Well, that doesn't, it applies in some ways in the workplace, right? Like don't hit people or curse at them or, do things like that. But once you get into the subtleties, everybody has a different way that what motivates them, what worries them, what interests them. And obviously this is something you talked about at length, like in your EQ training, that everybody's got different things that makes them happy and what they need. And you have to really pay attention to that. Otherwise, you're not actually caring for your people. You're just casting out what you think it should look like, not actually thinking about what they need.
I don't know if you ever read the book, If Disney Ran Your Hospital, but it's basically talking about the fact that if Disney ran your hospital, they would focus on taking care of the people who work there, the doctors, the nurses, the admin people. And if you do that, they're then going to turn around and take good care of your clients. But if you're always focused on the clients and you're kind of ignoring the people who are dealing with them, it rarely goes well.
Yeah. Well, everybody has the responsibility, and that example is a good one because it's not the job of the people who administer the hospital to take care of the patients. It's the job of the people who work in the hospital. So it makes perfect sense what you said.
One thing that also makes me think about is when I'm talking to people who, are the producers and they have a manager, I'll always tell them, your job is to figure out how to communicate well with your boss. But then when I talk to the boss, I'm like, it is 100% your job to figure out how to communicate well with your people. I wish that both sides in every conversation would take 100% responsibility for communicating well. It rarely happens. And when push comes to shove, it's normally the leader who really has to take the brunt of the responsibility. Is that something that you've found in your organization?
Well, again, I think it varies by person. My style is very much, there has a big component of it, which is you got to sit with the person, you got to let them talk, and you got to have a lot of patience, right? You got to learn how to keep your mouth closed for a good period of time. Not necessarily literally closed, but give them the control of the floor, control of the conversation, and let them take whatever time that they need to express themselves and get their thoughts out. And not just one time, right? But, on a recurring basis. Not necessarily every conversation you ever have with this person, obviously, but that's the only way that you can ever get to know them. And so a big part of that was learning to be comfortable with the occasional conversation that might move more slowly than I would have it move if I were controlling the pace. And also that might involve, a lot of wandering around. There are some employees at Edge who come to me and they have clearly thought in great detail about what matters to them, and they come with, I have a 3-point plan, here it is. Bing, bang, boom. I have other employees that come to me and it seems like it's the first time they're thinking about it, and those people might take an hour and basically wander through the woods, leading me by the hand wherever they're going, and I'm just going with them. And then eventually we come to a clearing, and I understand what's going on, and then I can start addressing it and help them. But when you understand someone's thought process and how they're getting to what they're thinking about, and not just what they're thinking, but how they get there, you can really understand it better. So I refuse to make it 100% my responsibility in the sense that I want to have that component of understanding who those people are. There is the occasional employee who just won't talk. I'll give them control of the conversation and they just won't really pick up that ball and run with it. Then it is 100% my responsibility. And those are my most uncomfortable conversations because I don't want it to be me simply telling them what I think is best for them or the situation. I want some feedback from them. Even if I'm ultimately going to disagree with them or push back on what their take is or try to tweak it or whatever, I still want to have that information. It's very hard to do if you don't get that. I'm not sure I answered your question directly, but
that's quite all right.
Talking about meandering, I did a little meandering my own there.
We all do it sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I say take 100% responsibility, it doesn't mean that that's the person who does all the talking. It means that you are responsible for having the conversation go well, whether that is prompting the person or just asking that extra question to get to the why, like you talked about, not just what they think, but why they think it and how they got there. So if both sides are willing to do that, then the conversation goes better.
Well, let me ask you, how do you define the conversation going well? Because I think that's a whole interesting topic in and of itself.
Oh, that putting me on the spot. Thank you. If both people have a very clear understanding of what the other person thinks and wants, and they can come to an agreement, even if the agreement is to disagree. Like sometimes you're going to end up and say, if you're the manager and you can't get the other person to agree, then that's okay as long as the person understands why. And then the manager may have to say, I know you don't agree with this, but we have to do it anyway because it's my decision to make. So I think as long as both people understand each other and the why and are willing to accept the outcome, even if it's not the one they want, that seems like a successful conversation.
I don't subscribe to that. It's interesting.
Great.
So
tell me yours.
I have a narrower view. Look, I don't dispute what you're describing, and there are situations where what you just described is the best thing that you can come to, for sure. But I try to do something a little bit further than that whenever I can. So, let's make up an egregious example that has never happened. Somebody comes to me and says, hey, I know I'm currently, manufacturing parts in our clean room. What I really want to do is do art. I want to draw elephants on the wall. And that's what I think we need, elephant art, and I'd like to spend the next year just doing that. And I'm saying, well, we can't pay you to do that. We don't need that. We actually need you to do the other thing. There's no job doing the thing that you're saying you want to do. Obviously, that's a situation that can't end with me saying, okay, right? And I would also say I really desperately don't want it to end with, well, we have to agree to disagree. What I would say is, what I would do in that scenario is I'd dig a little bit deeper. And I'd say, tell me why that's what you want to do. What's appealing to you about it? What are you get out of that you're not getting out of your current job? Right? And in that case, it's obviously going to be some very divergent answers, but maybe that person would say something like, I don't get to be creative in my job. I don't get to do any work with my hands, which is the example I gave. Both people would be working with their hands, but they could give you information like that. And then you have an opening, right, to figure out a path forward that works for all parties, right? Because in that scenario, I would say, that's really interesting. This sounds to me like we need to get more creativity into your job responsibilities. We do need people to design our business cards. We do need people to design our marketing flyers and pick our new logo and our coloring scheme. And I was going to ask, Mary or John to do that. But if you want to be in the lead or you want to work with Mary or John or whatever, I'd be super happy to do that. Or something like that, right? Now, it's not always that easy because there isn't always an answer. But the solution that I usually try to get to instead of the agree to disagree is let's try something and let's set a time and let's agree, and we're going to come back in X weeks or X months or X days and see how's it going, and do we want to continue this way? Do we want to tweak? Do we want to do whatever? To me, I find that to be the key. The really hard pill for anyone to swallow is walking out of a meeting without consensus. And agreeing to disagree is really not having consensus, even though you're calling it agreeing to disagree. People are walking out without satisfaction. Right? If you can walk out and say, I'm going to try to give you what you want, and let's meet up. Let's put it on the calendar right now when we're going to meet up, and you come prepared with this, I come prepared with this, we're going to do a check-in, we're going to see this. Even if the answer is, I have no idea how to let you scratch your itch for drawing elephants, let's spend the next month thinking about it. Let's come back in a month where we both have ideas of what it could look like and how it can serve the company and serve you. Those are the kinds of approaches that I would tend to take. And in a crazy case like that, in a month, a person would usually come back and say, yeah, I guess I see now, I can't draw elephants here. You know what I think I'm going to do? I went to Michael's this weekend and I bought a whole bunch of art supplies, and I'm just going to start drawing them on the weekends at home. I said, great, So does that make sense, how I think about it a little differently?
Absolutely, and I love it. I often talk about having a third option. People go into conversations and usually they think there's an option A and option B. And when there's only two options, it's basically a negotiation. And one side, or maybe both sides, are not going to be happy. But if you can look for the third option makes it a collaboration. And when you collaborate, you can usually come to an even better solution than the original A or B. So I 100% agree with what you just said as well.
And I agree. And I think the key is being willing to think outside the box. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that I think that solution that I'm proposing and that you just described works at small companies and large companies. Because large companies, you got a million functions all over the place, right? If someone came to you and said that, you would say to them, you really need to be in our marketing department or our graphic design department or whatever. Like, let me get you an intro with a manager over there and let's see if we can't, right? You have to have that conversation. Small companies are the same thing though. Everything still has to be done there. There's almost always something you can find as a manager that's vitally important to your company that can also scratch that person's itch. And then it's just a matter of how to keep the company fulfilling all the things it needs to be doing. You just have to be willing to have a little bit of flexibility and creativity as the manager, and obviously the employee does as well.
And we unfortunately need to start wrapping up. But one thing I've learned through parenting is if you're not careful when you're a parent, the default answer is no. And that's why it's the first word that kids learn when they're 2 or so, because you say no so often. And one of my brothers told me early on, he said, try to default to yes and only go to no when you have to. And it is such a mind shift. But managers also, if it's anything outside of the realm of what they've already done, the gut reaction is going to be no, because it's more work and it hasn't been done before. So it's hard to get out of that.
So I have a tip regarding that, and anyone who happens to be watching this who knows me already knows what this tip is going to be. So I used to teach new parent classes.
Wow.
I took them when I was a new dad, and then I taught them to new dads, and like absolutely what you said, 100%. So the trick is, don't phrase things as yes or no questions, right? So what you do with a toddler, and this works with employees. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting think of your employees as children and treat them like children. That's not what I'm saying. But it's a similar dynamic. When you go to your kid, the toddler, you don't say, hey, would you like chicken nuggets for dinner? No. Do you want pasta for dinner? No. What do you want for dinner? I don't know, right? You just go to them and say, hey, I got 2 choices. Do you want chicken nuggets or pasta?
Yeah.
Right? You're empowering the kid to make a choice and have control over what they get to eat. You're going to get them to pick one or the other. They're going to excitedly pick the thing, and then you'll provide that to them, and everybody gets what they want. That's the way I try to deal with employees too, right? Instead of, again, not treating them like children, but instead of saying to them, hey, this is, yes or no, I say to them, okay, well, would you prefer to do it this way? Or would you prefer to do it that way? Or would you prefer this function or that function? And if they're asking me, I do the same thing. I try to reinterpret the question not as a yes or no question, but as a what could this be, right? And if I can say yes, I'll just say yes. But if I'm going to say no, instead of saying no, I think of what other options could we think of, right?
Yep.
As you already said, you bring in that third option. So that's my communication tip.
Love it. So we've already jumped the gun to the last question. So before I ask the other 2, how can people reach out and learn more about you?
The best way to reach out to me is on LinkedIn. I go by Andy regularly, but you'll find me as Andrew on LinkedIn. You can always send me a direct message there, say that you heard me on the podcast. I respond to all the messages. Even the bots, sometimes I respond to them just for fun.
See what they come back with.
Yep.
Love it. So I will put those in the show notes so people can find you. And then you already answered a communication tip. The first question is normally, what is a place you would love to travel to and a place you've already been and did love?
What I find about traveling is, I'm not much of a foodie, and although I love learning about new cultures, I'm not really big into like nightlife or lots of traveling or whatever. I find that relaxation is the best thing. I mean, the place that I've visited the most, or the place that I visited that I love the most, would just be Hawaii. I mean, my wife and daughter and I took a trip to the Big Island a few years ago, and it was just fantastic. And it was just days and days of just hanging out and, getting to know some of the local businesses and beaches and just taking it easy. And I loved it. I have a cousin who lived there for years and said it gets old after a while, and I believe that, but for a vacation, I think it's perfect.
Nice. And then who do you think is a person who's a great communicator, whether someone we all know or just someone in your personal life?
It's an interesting question, and I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, and I do a lot of posting on LinkedIn, and I look at other posts that are written by people who are saying the same, like they're writing on the same subjects that I'm writing on, but they're saying things much more clearly or much more elegantly, or they're getting to the point in a much clearer way. And there's a guy who I only know on LinkedIn named Dean Lee. I've never met him in real life, but I love his writing, and he's writing really basic things about applying for jobs and being a candidate, and how do you prepare your resume, and what does it mean to have a PhD, and as an employer, do you care or not care? And these are topics that I always find interesting because I get asked about them so often by employees or by candidates or school graduates. His writing appears effortless and is just beautiful, and it rolls right off the page, and the meaning just goes right into your brain, and it's so simple. And I don't know how he does it, but his ideas are so clear. And even when I try to mimic his writing, I find my writing to be much more nebulous and harder for people to understand. I've studied it a lot. I haven't figured it out. So Dean's the guy I idolize in terms of his communication skills.
I will look him up. There was, I don't remember who it was in history, but he said, "I apologize that I didn't have enough time to send a shorter letter." And being brief and to the point, like you said, appears effortless, but it definitely takes work.
Yeah.
So Andy, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's been a pleasure.